An atheist professor publicly mocked Jesus Christ, but one student's calm response left the entire classroom stunned. The lecture hall at Stanford University seemed to swirl with a tense undercurrent well before class officially started. Rows of wooden seats stretched out in a semicircle, anchored by a long oak podium at the front of the room. The chatter of students drifted through the air in low waves, some discussing the upcoming topics, others simply passing the time with idle gossip or glances at their phones. A few stacks of books perched precariously on the side tables, waiting to be consulted or dismissed by the class's professor. Professor Frederick Gray was infamous, both within the philosophy department and across campus as a whole. Tall and lean, he had steel gray hair swept back from his forehead, giving him the look of an imperious actor ready to command a stage. And indeed, his lectures always had the flair of a performance. He didn't just teach, he orchestrated debates, he sparked controversies, and he challenged every assumption a student dared to bring into his classroom. That day's theme, according to the syllabus, was listed plainly: Religion versus Reason in the Modern World. Yet despite its unassuming title, anyone who had heard rumors of Professor Gray's methods knew what it implied. Faith would be put on trial. Past students still recalled how he would systematically invite anyone who professed religious belief to speak, then dismantle their arguments with razor-sharp logic and near-surgical precision. Rumor had it that he reveled in the drama of it all. The large clock on the wall clicked 1 minute before the hour, drawing the small talk to a close. Some of the students shifted in their seats, expecting the professor to appear any second with his signature flourish. A hush slid into the room. One by one, heads pivoted toward the double doors at the back. Then, right on cue, Professor Gray entered. He wore his typical navy blazer, a collared shirt beneath it, and had a slight grin tugging at one corner of his mouth. He placed a stack of notes on the podium, let his gaze scan the faces of the students, nearly 100 strong, and cleared his throat. Today's topic, he began, voice resonating in the hush, is a challenge to all who remain convinced there's a personal God watching over us. He paused just long enough to let the words settle. I urge you all to speak freely. After all, how can we truly understand the illusions we cling to unless we test them under fire? A ripple of anticipation traced through the crowd. Some of those present were here for that very spectacle. The moment someone dared to disagree, giving the professor an opening to unravel their convictions. Others sat with quiet dread. A handful wore expressions of curiosity, waiting to see which unfortunate soul would offer themselves up for debate. About 10 minutes into his introduction, Professor Gray launched into one of his favorite lines of attack. We live, he said, strolling across the small dais at the front, in an age of science and rationality. We have telescopes that peer into the corners of the universe. We've witnessed the subatomic wonders that define reality, and we have medicines so advanced that diseases once thought incurable are now treatable. Yet, he pressed his hand to his chest as though baffled, a staggering number of people still hold on to the notion of an omnipotent God, a so-called Heavenly Father, who knows and directs our every move. A few students nodded, some frowned, and others scribbled notes. The professor's tone deepened as he continued. But here's a question nobody seems to answer satisfactorily. If this Father is so loving and mighty, why do disasters strike? Why are there pandemics, wars, starvation across entire continents? His words thickened the air. Some shifted uncomfortably. It was the moment he'd cultivated for so long. That hush before the storm. He let a second of silence pass, poised to deliver what he believed was the coup de grace for any devout person who might dare speak up. And indeed, he spotted a figure at the back row, Barron Trump, tall with carefully combed hair and an unassuming sweater. Barron was known for his quiet nature. He'd slip into class without a fuss and rarely raised his hand. But something about his demeanor, calm, watchful, always made him stand out. While others might shrink in the face of confrontation, Barron seemed undaunted by any tension that might arise. Professor Gray's eyes locked on him. You, the professor said with that trademark smirk. Barron, isn't it? You're a believer. Am I correct? Barron, shifting his gaze up from his notes, responded simply, I am. A few quiet murmurs traveled through the seats. Another student, Jessica, who often backed Gray's arguments, lifted an eyebrow. She'd seen the professor demolish faithful students numerous times, and the scornful glee in Gray's eyes told her this might be the day's highlight. Then tell me, Gray said, leaning forward against his podium, why, if Jesus is so real and loving, does he let evil run rampant in the world? Heads turned, pages stopped rustling. Even those who might have been tempted to glance at their phones found themselves riveted. Barron sat upright, his hands relaxed on the desk in front of him. His eyes never wavered from the professor's. I believe, Barron answered softly, that the question is more about human will than simply God's inactivity. No frantic gestures, no immediate quotes of scripture, just a measured calm. A sudden shift in the atmosphere seized everyone's attention, where most students scrambled with responses, quoting verses or tripping over themselves in apologetics. Barron remained unruffled. It was as though the entire dynamic between the professor and his pupil reversed in that single instant. Gray had set his usual trap, but the quiet self-assurance in Barron's manner hinted at an unexpected confrontation to come. Professor Gray, as if sensing the change, pressed on. Human will, you say? Let's paint a scenario. If you watched a child wander onto train tracks while a train barreled toward them, wouldn't you step in? Or would you say, it's not my place. They have free will to walk there if they choose. He paused dramatically. Surely if God is love, he would save us from our own foolishness, from the tragedies that befall innocent people. And yet, we see no divine hand stopping those trains. Some in the class giggled nervously. Others groaned. They'd seen Gray use this metaphor before. It was a rhetorical blow aimed at the heart of any simplistic God is good argument. But Barron's posture did not alter. The train tracks example is a loaded one, Barron replied, voice steady. Yes, if you see someone powerless on the rails, you'd rescue them. That's the moral choice, because they literally have no defense. But you're comparing that to our entire existence, a space where we do have choices, where we can act or remain passive, where we can love or hate, help or harm. Professor Gray shook his head, feigning disappointment. So we're back to free will, are we? What about natural disasters, diseases, random accidents? You can't just chalk those up to human choices. That's the uncontrollable side of life. Barron nodded gravely, acknowledging the fairness of the question. Many tragedies occur that have nothing to do with our direct decisions, but we are not helpless in how we respond to them or how we prepare for them. Pain can unite people. It can awaken compassion. Often our greatest breakthroughs come after crises. A few eyebrows lifted in the crowd. It was a different approach than the usual God works in mysterious ways. Barron was describing a process, suffering, followed by collective empathy and growth. Professor Gray folded his arms, leaning back. So you're telling me that children dying from rare illnesses is worth it because it unites us in empathy? The hush in the room turned razor sharp. More than a few students stiffened at the pointed question. Barron let out a breath, as though he recognized how deliberately painful that scenario was. No, he said. I'd never claim that losing a child is a fair bargain for anything. It's not about tallying up heartbreak to trade for moral lessons. It's about recognizing that life here is fragile. We can respond with bitterness, or we can respond by showing care and changing what we can. Gray tapped the podium. Your argument is philosophical quicksand. You haven't proven a God, you've only shown people try to cope. Proof is often about perspective, Professor, Barron replied. I'm not here to slam a scientific chart on the table. Love itself isn't proven by a microscope, but we accept it as a real force in the world. Many students glanced at one another, some with curiosity, others unsettled. The professor was not used to hearing measured, calm reasoning that did not devolve into frantic attempts at referencing scripture or dogma. Instead, Barron was guiding the class toward the intangible nature of faith and morality. Jessica, normally silent until the professor needed her support, suddenly found her voice. Wait, she said, turning to Barron. I get that we grow from adversity, but that doesn't help when an earthquake kills thousands. Where's the moral lesson for the child trapped under rubble? This moment hung in the air like a dagger. Everyone waited for Barron to falter, to realize how bleak the world can be, how unstoppable tragedy can shatter the best arguments. Instead, Barron sighed softly. There is no simple justification for disaster. But let's remember how people respond in those times. Think about the volunteers, the rescue workers, the donations that flood in, the prayers whispered in countless languages, the communities built on mutual aid. Sometimes the darkest moments reveal the brightest compassion. Professor Gray seized on that. Compassion is a human trait, he declared, sweeping an arm out. Altruism is a result of social and evolutionary factors. You don't need a deity for that. And yet, Barron answered, we label some things as heroic and some things as cruel, suggesting there is a standard beyond mere survival. If everything were just survival instincts, altruism could be swiftly set aside by anyone who wants to get ahead by force. But the reason we're appalled by cruelty is that we sense morality is more than just a social pact. The professor shot back. Societies define morality. Look through history. You'll see norms change over time. True, Barron said, societies do change. But we still look at historical atrocities and deem them evil, even if the societies then found them acceptable. Where does that universal sense come from? Why do we recoil at the thought of genocide or slavery across centuries and cultures? If morality was purely relative, we wouldn't feel an innate horror. We might just say, well, that was normal for them. But we don't. Jessica glanced back at Professor Gray, as if to see how he'd sidestep this. He let a moment pass, possibly considering the best way to reassert his authority. The hush in the lecture hall deepened, the familiar tension building as though the next few words would either cement Gray's victory or tip the scales in Barron's favor. Finally, Gray made his move. He fixed Barron with a penetrating stare and lowered his voice. Tell me this. If God is truly present in our world, then why, beyond lofty arguments, do we never see a blatant miracle that cancels out suffering? Why no parted seas or burning bushes in the modern day? If your deity truly wants to show love. Murmurs flitted through the seats again. Some students half nodded in agreement. The question struck at the heart of those who wonder why the remarkable, biblical-scale marvels seem locked in ancient history. Barron's gaze traveled around the room for a second. Faith, he said at last, isn't an endless parade of spectacles. Genuine faith shapes how we act, how we love. We can't force God to perform a miracle on our schedule just to prove a point. That wouldn't be true faith, it would be spiritual theatrics. In the front row, a young man in a baseball cap lifted a hand hesitantly. But how can you expect a rational person to believe without seeing proof? We're taught to trust evidence, data, things we can replicate in the lab. Barron's eyes held a gentle understanding. I respect the need for evidence, he said. We can't just accept every claim blindly. But some truths are more subtle. Love, beauty, even abstract ideas like justice or dignity. We see their effects, but we don't measure them with beakers. We experience them, and they transform us. Silence blanketed the hall again, but this time it was thick with possibility. The crowd realized that Barron was pushing back as firmly as the professor was pushing forward, and that alone felt like a small miracle. Gray's well-worn tactics, for once, weren't summarily winning the day. Something in the dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. Gray paced behind the podium, a swirl of emotion flickering across his usually composed face. All right, he said, letting the tension sink. Let's talk about love if you insist on that intangible. Show me a chemical test that can identify real love from a passing infatuation. Where's the scientific yardstick for passion or loyalty? Barron's expression didn't change, but the class noticed an almost wry quirk at the corner of his lips. That's the point, he answered softly. We can't measure it exactly, but we know when we see it. The same is true for God. We sense his presence through intangible experiences, acts of kindness, transformations in hearts, a sense of moral imperative that transcends convenience. Gray shot back quickly. Or we fool ourselves into seeing patterns that we desire, because it comforts us to think there's a cosmic plan. People cling to illusions, especially if they soothe their fears of the unknown. Barron nodded. That's one possibility. But if you say it's only an illusion, you have to explain why so many, across time and culture, have consistently chased the same illusions of moral clarity, spiritual insight, and selfless love. Why do humans from every corner of the planet describe similar experiences when they talk about transcendent connections or deep convictions? Are we all biologically predisposed to the same comforting delusion? Professor Gray let out a measured sigh, trying to maintain control. He glanced toward the clock. Class was nearing its end, but he clearly wasn't ready to let Barron walk away with the last word. He inhaled, voice quieter, and asked a question that felt more personal than any he'd hurled before. Is there something that makes you so sure? Because typically, believers crumble under direct scrutiny, citing scriptures or dogma that might hold meaning for them, but no rational way to form me. So, Barron, why do you believe? Barron took a moment, eyes dropping briefly, as though in introspection. Then he looked up. I've seen cruelty up close, Professor. I've seen people do unthinkable harm to one another. But I've also witnessed unimaginable forgiveness, compassion that shouldn't be possible under normal logic. I've seen families of murder victims comfort the killers, people living in poverty who share their last bit of food with strangers. These acts defy a purely self-serving rationale. They speak to something deeper in us. For once, Gray remained silent. The lecture hall, too, hung on Barron's words. Barron continued in a subdued tone. Believing doesn't erase hardship. Faith is not a free pass from pain, but it frames the pain so it's not meaningless. It gives me reason to keep hoping, to keep loving, because I trust there's an ultimate foundation behind it all. Something that says love is more than just synapses firing for survival's sake. I call that something God. A hush followed. That hush was deeper, heavier than the ordinary quiet that marks the end of a class. It was the hush of nearly 100 students processing an unexpected perspective. Barron wasn't merely quoting verses or referencing ancient texts. He was offering a worldview that recognized suffering but sought meaning within it. Jessica broke the stillness. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised it. I lost my grandfather, she began, voice wavering. And I can't help but ask, why him? He was a good man, he gave so much to others, and yet he died painfully. How does that make sense if a loving God is in control? A wave of empathy passed through the classroom. It was a question that felt raw, genuine, unguarded. Everyone wondered how Barron would respond. Would he revert to cliches? Would he flounder? Barron turned to her, expression gentle. I'm sorry for your loss, he said. Sometimes we only see the cruelty of death, and it hurts. But often, loss changes us. It makes us value time we do have, draws families closer, and reminds us not to take each other for granted. It doesn't make the loss fair or easy. It just means it's not without potential growth or deeper love in response. That's not a proof of God, but it's a reflection of something bigger than just random chance. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, blinking back tears. She nodded, perhaps grateful for an answer that didn't trivialize her pain. Professor Gray's chest rose and fell in a slow breath. The bravado that usually fueled his lectures seemed to have been tempered. I admire your confidence, he admitted, voice huskier than before. But admiration isn't agreement. I still see no reason to accept that there's a cosmic being orchestrating these processes. Then don't accept it, Barron returned quietly, earning a few surprised looks from classmates. That's your right. Faith can't be mandated, it must be chosen. I'm not here to beat you in a debate. I'm here because I was asked for my view. Gray arched an eyebrow. But you must want me to believe, no? Barron offered a half smile. I would like everyone to see what I see, to experience the hope I find in my faith, but not because I cornered them. Faith thrives when it's freely embraced. A hush filled the room yet again. It was unusual. Professor Gray's showdowns typically ended with him triumphant and the challenger slinking away. or occasionally the professor growing bored with a typical preachy defense. This was different. The tension was replaced by a weighty introspection that pressed in on everyone. Suddenly, from the middle rows, a voice piped up. It was Ryan, one of the quieter students. "I've been on the fence about religion for a while," he said, glancing between Gray and Barron. "I keep hearing arguments for God's existence from religious folks about miracles or punishments for sin, and arguments from people like Professor Gray about random chance and illusions. But what you're saying now, it feels different. Less about winning an argument, more about offering a perspective. That alone makes me think, I don't know if I believe yet, but I see the value in your point of view." The professor's eyes flickered as Ryan finished. Gray parted his lips, perhaps to reestablish his authority, but then let the air out of his lungs in a slow sigh. He glanced at the large clock on the wall, only a minute left in the session. Perhaps he realized that continuing the exchange now would only underscore how the debate had slipped from his control. "Class," he announced in a voice lacking its usual confidence, "we'll pick this up next time. I expect your reflections on today's discussion in a written response. Analytical, mind you. This is not a theology course. Provide reasoned arguments." The bell rang at that exact moment, echoing through the hall. No one bolted for the door as usual. Instead, they remained in a kind of thoughtful lull, still grappling with the ideas set loose in the room. It felt like they were stepping out of a bubble back into reality when they finally began packing their laptops and notebooks. As the wave of students headed out, Jessica paused near Barron. "Thank you," she said, voice subdued. "I'm not entirely convinced, but I appreciate that you acknowledge the hurt. Sometimes that's all I need to keep going." Barron nodded. "We're all in this together," he answered with a small smile, then added, "Take care." A few other classmates offered Barron slight nods or thoughtful looks as they filtered into the corridor. Professor Gray, collecting his papers on the podium, watched Barron from across the room as though weighing something. Barron approached him, a polite expression on his face. "Thank you for letting me speak freely, Professor," he said. Gray looked at Barron for a long moment, then turned his gaze down to his notes. "I encourage open debate," he said softly, "though I must admit, it's rare I find someone so composed under fire. You handled yourself well." Barron's lips curved into a faint smile. "You present tough questions. They're worth considering." Gray didn't respond to that. His expression turned thoughtful, and he gave Barron a curt nod. Without further words, Barron turned and exited the lecture hall. Outside, Stanford's campus buzzed with its usual activity. Bikes crisscrossing the pathways, small clusters of students chattering as they headed off to the library or coffee shops. The golden sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the buildings with a warm, honeyed light. Barron took a measured walk toward a row of tall pines, letting the evening air fill his lungs. He reflected on what had happened. He hadn't expected to be singled out, nor had he planned an elaborate defense. Yet something within had guided him to speak plainly about love, morality, suffering, and resilience. He pulled out his phone to see a few messages from classmates he barely knew. One read, "Thanks for today. I didn't realize religion could be discussed like that. I'd love to chat more sometime." Another simply said, "You gave me a lot to think about." He typed short but gracious replies, a hint of warmth creeping into his face. It wasn't about winning. It was about sparking something, an openness to see beyond strict empiricism, or at least to realize faith might not be the irrational crutch that many assume. As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Barron spotted someone standing under the shade of a tree, waiting. Professor Gray. The older man wasn't wearing his usual lecturing mask. Instead, he seemed pensive, hands tucked into his blazer pockets. Had he followed Barron intentionally? Barron approached with caution. Gray's gaze drifted from a passing group of chatty sophomores to Barron. The professor's voice, when it came, was quieter than Barron had ever heard it. "I hope you realize," he started, "that I question religion not because I enjoy being the villain, but because I want to see if it can withstand honest scrutiny." Barron nodded gently. "That's fair. Truth shouldn't fear scrutiny." Gray's lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "I used to believe," he confided after a pause, "but I lost my faith years ago, in a time of personal tragedy. I found no comfort in my prayers. It felt like emptiness in return. So I turned to reason. I found control in logic, in debate, in systematically testing every assumption." A moment of silence, broken only by distant laughter of students crossing the courtyard. Barron didn't interrupt. Finally, Gray said, "I'm telling you this because I saw something in your argument that I hadn't expected. It wasn't naive. You acknowledge suffering is real, but it doesn't erase hope. That's a balance I struggle to find." Barron's voice remained soft. "Professor, I'm sorry for what you went through. Faith doesn't come in a neat formula. It's more like a relationship, fragile, needing attention, sometimes easy to lose when pain overwhelms us. If you ever want to talk more about it without the crowd of a lecture hall, I'd be glad." Gray ran a hand across his forehead, as if burdened by old memories. Then, with a short nod, he turned away. "We'll see," he said, voice barely above a whisper. He walked off, merging into the flow of students heading toward the campus gates, leaving Barron alone under the rustling pines. In the days that followed, the campus buzzed quietly about the faith debate. People swapped second-hand accounts of how Barron had remained serene in the face of the professor's usual gauntlet. Some expressed gratitude that someone had finally faced Gray without wilting. Others dismissed it as yet another conversation that changed nothing. A few remained caught in the middle, uncertain of where they stood, but curious enough to keep asking questions. Meanwhile, Barron carried on with his other classes, seldom bringing up the encounter unless someone else did first. He was neither smug nor timid, just the same measured presence everyone had come to expect. Occasionally, he'd overhear a hushed remark in the hallway, "Hey, that's the guy who took on Gray." But it never lingered. What truly changed, at least in subtle ways, was the way people approached the concept of faith in Gray's class. After that day, fewer of them were quick to dismiss it. They argued from angles of sociology or science, but tended to show more respect for the possibility that, behind everything, there could be a dimension not easily quantifiable by standard measurements. A week later, at the start of the next lecture, Professor Gray briefly recapped the prior session. "Last time," he began, "we touched on the tension between free will, the existence of suffering, and the belief in a benevolent deity. Your written reflections," he added, scanning the class, "were varied. Some approached the subject with purely rational analysis. Others chose a more personal route." There was a flicker in his eyes, hard to read, but it lacked the earlier showman's glee. Perhaps it was caution or a softened edge. "We'll continue exploring the concept of morality and whether it can be explained entirely by society's evolution." He didn't single out Barron this time. He didn't mock or posture. Instead, he transitioned to the day's reading on humanistic ethics, presenting arguments from secular philosophers. The discussion was lively, but that undercurrent of performance was gone, replaced by a more balanced approach. As class wrapped, Gray offered no scathing teardown of religious thought, nor did he shy away from tough questions. He simply closed his notes and said, "Next week, we'll examine moral realism, whether it suggests a dimension beyond human consensus." Students packed up, buzzing with interest. Jessica, walking out, threw Barron a measured smile. He returned a friendly nod. No words needed, just a moment of mutual respect after the previous week's intense exchange. Barron lingered, and as the last few students left, Gray gestured for him to come over. They stood side by side near the podium, sunbeams from tall windows casting long lines across the tiled floor. "I read your reflection paper," Gray said, voice low but not harsh. "You wrote about how suffering can shape our moral imagination and deepen empathy. You also mentioned historical figures, Harriet Tubman, Viktor Frankl, Corrie ten Boom, people who found purpose in their faith despite horrors." Barron gave a small nod. "I think their lives show that adversity can become a crucible for a deeper sense of meaning and compassion, rather than only proving life's randomness." Gray looked at him, expression inscrutable. Then for the first time he extended his hand. Barron blinked in mild surprise and then grasped it. The handshake lasted a second longer than typical. As Gray pulled away, he said, "Thank you for bringing perspective I haven't considered in a while." Barron smiled softly. "Any time, Professor." And with that, they parted. The hallway welcomed them with the routine swirl of student voices, the clap of footsteps, and the rustle of book bags. Outside, a gentle breeze lifted leaves across the manicured lawns. Barron paused beneath the campus archway. His thoughts drifted, not to triumphant declarations of victory, but to gratitude that one conversation could unlock new lines of thinking on both sides. Faith, reason, love, suffering. These were not matters to be resolved in a single lecture or a neatly packaged debate. They were the lifelong questions that shape how one sees the world. As he walked on, Barron hoped that, in some quiet hour, the professor would open his heart just a crack to the possibility that God was more than a relic from ancient texts, because sometimes change begins with the smallest shift in perspective. And so what began as a routine challenge from an atheist professor ended in a subtle, profound transformation of the usual script. Students who witnessed the exchange didn't all walk away converted, but many walked away thinking differently. Some felt that, for once, a believer had not simply folded in the face of academic pressure but offered insights shaped by empathy and honest reflection. In the hush of that lecture hall, and in the soft resonance of the conversations that followed, the seeds of deeper inquiry were planted. If one was willing to look, they could see glimpses of something larger. Call it love, call it conscience, call it the divine spark that reason alone couldn't fully capture. A single debate didn't solve the problem of evil or prove the existence of God once and for all, but it did demonstrate that faith need not be reduced to naive dogma, nor rationality to unfeeling cynicism. Somewhere in that space between them, where free will, moral intuition, and compassion converge, there might yet be room for mystery and awe. And that is often where real discovery begins.